Wanted man, you'll be a wanted man.
There's a new song and dance going on.
Darren Rose Radio. Thanks for hanging out, checking us out on darrenroseradio.com. That's the site where you can find all the social networks and all past episodes, videos, all that stuff. Hanging out today is a man I'm very fortunate to have and looking forward to hanging out with today. He spent 35 years in something called a newspaper?
Yeah, they come out on like recycled trees.
That's amazing.
You can hold them in your hand, and sometimes the ink runs off on your fingers.
Yeah, it gets everywhere and smudgy, and yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, the last 6 years he's spent dominating the L.A. music scene. If a band has come out of L.A. in the last 6 to 8 years, chances are this guy has talked about him first on his blog, Buzzbands.la.com.
Buzzbands.la.
What did I say?
But you put .com. It's a .la.
Oh, you got one of the .las.
Yeah, it's sexy. .la is sexy.
That is sexy. That's the new thing now. And they charge a little bit extra for the .la.
A little bit, but it's minimal. It's minimal.
Yeah. Well, he's been called the last great music journalist, and I would agree with that. He is a cigarette-smoking, coffee-drinking, iPhone 1 using hell of a man, Kevin Bronson. Now, how did you get the writing bug? How did you get into journalism?
I got it really early when I was a paper boy, when I was a kid. I was just fascinated by everything that I could get from the world between the pages of the newspaper every morning. I was one of those early morning paper boys who was out there waking people up, throwing folded up papers on their doorstep.
Did you grow up really a big music head? What was your music influences?
Well, I did. I mean, I grew up in the heyday of AM radio.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just old enough that I grew up with and remember, a lot of the great 60s music when it hit, a lot of the great 70s music when it hit. I remember being able to tune into, my local AM radio station and hear artists as diverse as the Rolling Stones, the Spinners, the Beatles. Back in those days on AM radio, you got there wasn't the fragmentation of musical genres like there are now. You heard folk songs, you heard rock songs, you heard soul songs, and that was the top of the era, I think.
Yeah, and there weren't 25 radio stations or 50 radio stations in a market. There was probably 2 or 3.
I mean, Peoria was a mid-sized city. There was basically one AM music station, and by the time the 70s hit, there became a couple. There was a couple FM outlets, including the university's public radio outlet that played a little bit more adventuresome music.
Thousands and thousands of live performances later, what was your first live exposure to music?
It actually came a little bit late. It's not like Peoria was a great mecca of
wasn't that the main stop for
live shows. But in the early 70s, I saw one of my heroes at the University of Illinois in Champaign, which is about an hour and a half away from my hometown. It was Jackson Browne.
That's amazing. Jackson Browne has been a very popular answer on the show, along with James Taylor. So something about those.
You've been interviewing elderly people then.
No, I mean I had Nick Long, who we know from Dark Waves, on last week, and he said James Taylor, which was mine. So back to journalism and newsprint. You get your first gig in Peoria, and I know through your career, you've said you've been in every time zone, 6 different markets. You've done sports writing. When did you feel like the radio of the newspaper of yesteryear, the traditional newsprint, was starting to suffer, was starting to drop out a little bit?
Oh, about 2006, 2007.
Really?
Did you? I was in denial before that. I think it was suffering before that, but I was in denial before that.
Do you think it? You think it was almost exclusively the advent of news online, like news online, or was it the funding of newspapers that was no longer able to keep things afloat?
It was a combination of both. I think the newspapers, their revenue stream began eroding before that because of other competition, other ways for people to advertise their stuff. I mean, it wasn't that long ago in historic terms. A few decades ago, that newspapers were virtually a license to print money.
Oh yeah,
because there was no place else to for people to advertise their goods, for businesses to advertise consumer goods. Television started to erode that in the 1950s and the 1960s. Newspapers bounced back by reinventing themselves a little bit, and making themselves more visually appealing and things like that.
But I think that there's a lot of parallels between what's happened in radio and newspaper, because, and even television in terms of advertising, because for decades there was those three primary outlets for advertisers, and now everything you can advertise on an app, you can advertise on millions of websites. So there's a lot of parallels. I think that newspaper did a decent job of keeping up, because every paper now has an online. There's still journalists, there's still writers, there's just not the physical print.
A lot of newspapers were slow to adapt to the online, including our little local rag here in Los Angeles.
The LA Times.
They were not ahead of the game.
Okay.
And by and large, print publications, or what's known as old media, have been playing catch up. Some of them have caught up really well. Some of them haven't. I think almost all of them are still struggling to find a revenue model that will support the business. Gathering news. I teach journalism at a local college, and as I tell my students, gathering the news is not free, but people expect to get their news now.
How do you get your
free.
news?
I still subscribe to the paper.
You still get it at your doorstep every morning.
I sit on my patio and read the paper.
It's a great
and I get a lot of my news via the internet and via various online streams now, like everybody else. But I still like the physical process of consuming the news by leafing through the newspaper, because there's something about that process. I'm much more likely to be surprised or to learn something that I had not expected to learn by reading a physical product than I am by going online, because there are so many algorithms at work online that almost everything is tailored to what you're already interested in.
Right.
And you don't know what might surprise you, what you might previously not be aware of, that's going to show up when you turn the page of the newspaper.
Right. Well, and what about books? Do you still use physical? Do you still read physical books?
Sure.
Okay. What about
not as much as I'd like, but yes.
Yeah. And do you subscribe to alerts? AP alerts and MSNBC, CNN news alerts, or
no?
You still just get it the old-fashioned way?
There are certain. I have certain trusted sources that are on my Twitter feed, so I can see what's happening there.
Yeah, Twitter seems like the new newswire. If you subscribe to the right, or you follow the right Twitter people, that's basically a newswire.
It really is.
Especially for those that are all the eyewitness accounts that are available.
Especially if you curate it with some degree of intelligence and thought, it can be incredibly valuable. If you don't curate it, then it's a monumental time suck.
Oh yeah. You said you started to feel around 2006 the bottom slipping out, and you were in a little bit of denial.
Yeah. I'd been working for the LA Times for 15 or 16 years, and I guess I had kind of an unspoken confidence that the news would prevail, that journalism would prevail, the profession of journalism.
You're a romantic.
Yes. And then, They canceled my column. They canceled the section I was working for, and then they canceled me.
And along with many others.
Yes, I went out the door with a lot of others.
And they, and I know that it happened in radio, it happened at record labels, it happened at print. It seemed like there was that internet bust in the early 2000s that a lot of companies, a lot of industries never recovered from, and we're still kind of recovering from, trying to find how to adapt these industries to the new model. And radio's still figuring out, major record labels are still figuring out. And what's happening is you have a lot of the independent guys like yourself and me, and they're, we're in the trenches trying to figure out the new model. We've talked about, you have something like Buzzbands.la and monetizing it, doing a podcast and monetizing it. And, there's still a lot to be figured out with this new paradigm of what's happening.
Right.
And you still have radio stations and newspapers that are figuring out where's all the money, how do we harness all this advertising?
Exactly. I mean, KCSN, where I have my Sunday night show, is actually a listener supported station.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a pledge drive coming up this weekend where, we're going to be asking listeners for money. It's a different beast than commercial radio. It's music 24/7, which makes it even a different beast than most public radio stations.
Oh, yeah.
So it's got a lot going for it that way, but then twice a year you've got to sit down and beg people for money.
Just give us a few of the highlights. I know that we're in several different markets in news. I know that you were in LA during the 80s with the World Series and some huge sports moments. What are some of those highlights for you?
In sports?
In just being a newsman in LA.
I worked for a small newspaper in Los Angeles in the 1980s, the Pasadena Star News. It afforded me the opportunity to, to cover some big time sports, even though we were not a big time paper.
Yeah.
We were just kind of in the right place at the right time, and that allowed me to be in the right place at the right time. So I got to witness, the Lakers playing in the NBA Finals.
The Bird Magic era.
Kirk Gibson's home run in the 1988 World Series.
Yeah.
Things like that. At various junctures in my career, I got to cover, World Series, Super Bowl, NBA Finals. I'm pretty lucky.
Yeah, and I love your story about transitioning into music because, like we said, you were always a music head. The paycheck came from sports and various aspects of news, but you were always into music. And let's tell the story of how you evolved from doing what you were doing, and you were doing some layout and some graphic design work as well.
It was just a lot of as with anybody's career, I think a lot of things happen by pluck and by accident.
Absolutely.
And a lot of it is being in the right place at the right time, and a lot of it is being willing to reinvent yourself so you can keep putting food on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
doing what you love. I mean, that's another thing is
or finding a way to love what you're doing.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people who just say, screw it, I'm going to go get a 9 to 5 or somewhere.
Yes. I mean, if you talk to any millennial these days, or read their Facebook feeds, their mantra always seems to be, "Don't do anything you don't love."
Right.
Because you're entitled to that as a human being, and I beg to differ. You're not entitled to that. So sometimes it's, if you are lucky enough to pursue your passion and do what you love and make a living at it, then I congratulate you. But for a lot of in the real world, a lot of the times, it's a matter of finding a way to love what you do.
But I think for the millennials too, they're also part of that instant generation of 7-second attention span. I want everything now. It should be at me.
Instant gratification, sure, but
and they don't. But they also don't expect to put in their dues. And I think everybody can do what they love if you start out in the trenches. I love radio, and I was an intern, and I took jobs at stations that I didn't love the content or the format, but I still did it because I wanted to get to where I eventually got. But I don't think I think the millennial generation doesn't quite see that.
Oh, I think they're learning it. I mean,
they're learning it because our generation's telling them.
No, not really. I think they're learning it because, gosh, I know a lot of interns who were way past intern age, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's so hard to break into a lot of businesses right now, or a lot of industries right now, that I think a lot of, especially 20-somethings, people in their mid-20s and even late 20s, are still paying more dues than they should have to, because
A lot of competition.
there's a lot of competition, and the job market is not good.
And you probably can speak to this better than I. Salaries aren't as good as they were either. I started out in sports radio in Seattle. Names you might know, Mitch in the Morning and Graz and Gas, and these guys that were, during that mid-late 90s, when all that money, all that, the internet came about, and their salaries were ridiculous. And then the bottom dropped out, and their salaries now are probably less than they were 15 years ago.
Oh, sure.
And I think that, doctors are making less. Lawyers are probably making less.
That I doubt.
Well, depends what sort, that's a whole other conversation, the medical world. But
That I doubt.
did you find that in your career in journalism that, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, salaries fluctuated quite a bit in media?
No, not really. It all depended on the size. In the newspaper business, it depended on the size of the newspaper you were working for, in the market you were working in. My salary throughout the formative years of my career, which were probably 1980, the 1980s. Let's just say the 1980s. Every time I made a move, it was to a slightly bigger market for slightly more money. And, my life improved incrementally all those years, with every move.
And obviously you got to be willing to move, too, because like you said, you went several different markets, and it's just part of the chain. It's part of the chain of command.
I mean, I was very early, and, in 1984, I was faced with here, dude, you're living in one of the coolest college towns in the country, but somebody's offering you a job in Greeley, Colorado. Are you going to take it? And
Money
I did.
Talks. Yeah.
And I did. It wasn't necessarily for the money. It was more for the opportunity. I went from being, kind of a low-level sports writer to sports editor.
I want you to tell the story of how, when you were at the L.A. Times, it came to be that you started the music column.
In the 2000s, the paper was reinventing itself, or in a constant state of reinventing itself. And I was working as a graphic designer, a page designer in the entertainment section, and I had an opportunity to go be a word editor for a new entertainment section that they were starting, and I kind of jumped at that. And when the opportunity came to do a little column on the side, which ended up being called Buzzbands, I said, sure. And I kind of did that. I did that weekly column at the beginning in my spare time. It started in 2002. I didn't know much. I knew almost nothing about the music industry, and only had kind of a vague sense of the local scene. But as soon as you're working at the LA Times and people in the music world realize that you might write about their artist or their band, then suddenly you start getting emails and invitations and people sending you things and
wanting to meet you.
Knocking down your door.
Exactly, yeah. And that was kind of the beginning of you reinventing yourself, not really to the point because you were still at the Times, and you couldn't predict the future, but that was kind of the next step of where you are now in your career of being an extremely influential music guy.
It's not just that I like hearing new music, but I like the process of discovering it. And so that's what kind of drove me to run myself into the ground with this website.
I know that you listen to a lot of it, but what's your mind process, or is it more of an emotional or visceral thing that happens when you hear music?
Well, a lot of my personal tastes are very song based because of when I grew up. Everything was a 3-minute radio. Everything was a 3-minute radio song.
Yeah.
Probably the artist that changed my life more than any other was Todd Rundgren.
Well, Why is that?
Well,
It's a name I haven't heard much.
Go back and listen to the album Something Anything, which came out in 1972.
Okay.
And then listen to the follow-up albums he put out the next couple of years, including 1973's A Wizard, a True Star. It's as experimental as anything that was going on in those days. It's as genre mashing as anything that goes on today.
You'll have to check it out.
You know, brilliant songs, whether they were written in the context of here's a 3-minute song that works on radio, or here's a wacky song that explores some new sonic or lyrical territory. That really signaled to me that, like, okay, there's a world beyond the 3-minute pop or rock
The
song.
average, the typical run-of-the-mill stuff.
Right. And that was probably the beginning of me as like an explorer, or at least as a more open-minded consumer of music, because it's like, oh wow, this is different. This is really interesting. Here's something I haven't heard before. Here's a combination of instruments I haven't heard before. Here's a great lyrical hook. Here's a great turn of a phrase.
Yeah.
Here's a great melodic hook. Here's a great piece of vocal phrasing.
Yeah.
I mean anything can attract you to a song, can help you latch onto a song.
Right. I mean, do you think music is a strong, and not just looking at L.A. or just any band anywhere? Do you feel like music is as strong now as it has been over the last 2, 3, 5, 6 years?
No, I think it's really limited, actually. I think that there's a lot of genre music. There's not a lot of music that crosses over and has a wide appeal. You can hear a song on the radio and say, "Oh, that's a synth pop song. That's
Right.
That's a synth pop new wave song."
And but as soon as you do that, though, it seems like it discredits that song, because that doesn't mean that it's a bad song. It just means that it's very quickly pigeonholed.
And it's limited in its appeal.
True, because it's been done.
Almost everything has been done now.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard.
Well, I want to bring up this band that you mentioned to me, Dorothy. So what makes it spectacular?
That it's done properly and with some panache and with some personality and with some charisma. I think that's I don't want to sound like a curmudgeon, but that's kind of the most we can hope for these days. That there's a certain amount of songcraft involved, which there is. There's a certain amount of charisma and star appeal involved, which there is. And there's a certain amount of spectacle, i.e., can you pull this off live and make it, like, memorable? Which, in that band's case, there is. If you were to look at it from a curmudgeon's point of view, it's like, oh, it's another 4-piece blues rock band.
Right.
But it's sometimes it's all about the details.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk a lot about on the show is the other elements besides the song itself. What's the band's story? What's their image? Where are they going? Do they have a tour? Is this just a one-off EP? There's so many other things that are going to help connect the masses to that particular song or artist.
You bet.
Yeah, and a lot of times bands fall by the wayside because they did have a great song, but yet they didn't have those other elements. And then they wonder why they didn't make it.
Sure. I think a lot of electronic music, a lot of electronic pop music right now, I'm separating that from EDM, which is
dance culture,
which is a spectacle unto itself. A lot of electro pop bands have struggled because their production techniques are very sophisticated, and you can make a song sound great on the radio. You could make it sound ballsy.
In the studio, yeah. But then you go do it live.
And they have not been able to replicate that energy live. Or if they do try to replicate that energy live, they rely on so many gimmicks, whether it's
Tracking.
costumes, light shows, backing tracks, stuff like that, that it loses its immediacy. Part of music's appeal is its immediacy. And a lot of bands like that can't pull it off live. On the other hand, guitar bands are kind of suffering from the same thing, because it's like, how many 4-piece guitar bands have you seen on stage that don't have that great of a stage presence, even though their songs might be fantastic and they might be able to shred, they don't move you from your spot on the floor.
I want to go over I want to throw a handful of topics at you and just get your thoughts on it. South by Southwest. It's
become much more of a branding opportunity than it is a music festival. And the marketing world has really taken over and ruled, which is good and bad. I think I'll just talk about the way that it's good is that it's helping artists make a living, to align themselves with brands, because artists, musicians have struggled so much in recent years to produce revenue from their art. People expect their music for free. They don't make money off CD sales anymore. Touring is a huge slog. And
expensive. Yeah.
So if a brand is going to pay you much more than you'd get for a club show to do a corporate event, to align yourself, with their product, then more power to the artist, I guess.
But I would argue that there's probably only maybe 10% of the bands that perform at South by are attached to some brand. That a lot of them they'll save up and they'll, I remember seeing the Lumineers at South by Southwest and interviewing them after they played with nobody paying attention to them on the lawn at the Four Seasons.
Sure.
And they said they'd been working for 3 months to save and go there. And I think a lot of bands do that. They'll save, they'll go, they'll play 7 or 8 shows in 3 days.
I do. I agree.
If you were a band or if you were managing a band, would you direct them to go?
Not anymore.
You wouldn't, yeah.
Not anymore.
Right.
I mean, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, yes. I mean, I was there, the year that Local Natives went down there before anybody gave a hoot about them, and they played something like 10 shows in 4 days.
Right.
And some of them did well for them. It helped them move the dial. I've seen, several years ago, I saw other bands from Los Angeles go down there, and their shows, they're in the right place at the right time. It helped them move the dial with their career.
Yeah.
I heard one story this year about that happening to a local band, and I could not have been happier for them, because everybody
Who was it?
Because everybody thought 2 or 3 years ago that South by Southwest had jumped the shark. When you've got a stage in downtown Austin that looks like a big Doritos vending machine, that your festival might have jumped the shark, right?
Yeah.
And I actually said the brand name. My bad. Sorry,
all right.
I shouldn't have given them. I shouldn't have even name checked them. That was so audacious.
Who was the band that came
so
out
bad.
of
there? Local psych rock band Fever the Ghost.
Okay.
They played some shows down there, and they had a little something going in the U.S. But the people from Heavenly Records in the UK saw them at South by Southwest and pursued them, and they eventually got a deal based on a show that they, based on a first encounter, a blind date at South by Southwest.
And that is rarity.
I think that that's a good comparison that can be made. For my young single friends who work OkCupid, or OK Kill Me, as one of my friends called it, Going to South by Southwest is like going on 50 blind dates.
Yeah.
There's a good chance you'll go 0 for 50.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of leads to the next topic. Festivals. We're in such a festival culture right now. I mean, speaking Culture Collide in L.A., Echo Park Rising, L.A. Rising, you name it. There's, Coachella. Every city, every state now, compared to 10 years ago, has at least 2 or 3 festivals. In my mind, that makes it difficult for bands of any level to tour. It's like right now in October, November.
It just makes life hard for booking agents. So
it does
heck with them.
because I would say right now it's safe to say that a lot of the festivals for next year are already booked. I would say that Paul over at Coachella has already booked 90% of that festival.
Bet you half, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
I mean, do you think that's here to stay? That festival culture in music?
As long as 2 things don't happen. As long as they don't price themselves into oblivion, because right now, if you look at it purely from the point of view of a consumer, if you were a consumer advocate, okay, and this is the way I look at festival lineups. If I'm a consumer, is it worth my money to go to a festival to see that many bands that I like? It's how I looked at the 2 local festivals going on this weekend, for instance. Culture Collide, 3 days of music. No, not a lot of big names there. A lot of opportunities to discover up and coming bands, though.
That's a great discovery festival. Yeah,
and a wristband for the entire weekend, $30.
Great.
I'm thinking pretty good value if I'm a consumer advocate, right?
But like you said, no headliners, no radio-friendly bands, or at least at this point, there's no bands that are on radio that are
a lot of good independent artists.
And there's the Pomona Festival,
and then there's the Moon Block Party on Saturday, which has got Spoon at the top of the bill.
Great, yeah.
And then the 3 black bands: Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, Black Angels, Black Lips, along with like
Mets,
Mets and Unknown Mortal Orchestra, Deep Valley, a bunch of small local psych rock bands.
And how much is that one?
It's $45.
Okay.
In advance.
Yeah.
The day of the festival, it's gonna go up to 50 something. I think I just posted the set times today. 3 stages, 1 day. Noon, basically noon to midnight.
And that's a reasonable price.
I think there might be 20 or 21 bands on the bill altogether, or something. In that vicinity. And it's like, okay, if you go see Spoon at the Wiltern,
it's going to be $30.
It's going to be $30 right there just to see Spoon. After you pay service fees and stuff like that. Well, here you're going to get to see Spoon and a spoonful of other bands.
Yeah, exactly.
So I look at that and I say, great value.
Yeah.
Great value.
Yeah.
Coachella, to me, still a good value. Not a great value, but a good value, because it's a lot of music to take in over 3 days. They only sell you a 3-day wristband. It's not like you can get a 1-day pass. And the cost of actually going out there and staying, you have to weigh into attending the festival.
Yeah, and $10 beers and $20 pizzas and all that stuff too. So
yeah. There's the that's the other thing about festivals. They're big business.
They are big business, yeah.
And there's a reason that Sean Carlson and FYF have blown up, because and are now partnered with Golden Voice, because even from the very beginning, it was a very well curated festival that had a certain sensibility about it that people dialed into. Yeah. And the past few years that it has been affiliated with Golden Voice, the price has gone up incrementally. The new location this year, more expensive concessions. It's in the big leagues now too.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but the news cycle now is 24/7. Obviously, I feel like the music industry is 24/7. Obviously, in some capacity, but right now, I go inside, turn on CNN. It's ISIS and Ebola. You turn on the music, the radio, and it's the Fits and the Tantrums and Vance Joy or Milky Chance. It's always like there's millions of headlines out there, millions of bands, but it seems to me like the primary focus is always the kind of 5%, and
it always has been though.
Yeah.
I think in one of the classes I teach, I talk about I compare like my hometown AM radio station's top 40 from say 1969, just a random top 40 list from a week in 1969 and 1970 to a week in 1974. And it was really interesting. I mean, that's a Breadbasket USA AM radio station I grew up with, right? But there was so much cutting edge and influential music on the radio, on that AM radio station in, say, 1970. And by the time 1974 came around, the industry had kind of taken over. What you got is what you were getting on the radio were established bands' third singles from their album. Or
which never happens anymore. Or you never get deep cuts. You rarely get deep cuts anymore.
Or
3 singles from an album is a lot.
Or you got a lot of artists who were already past their prime, or had moved on from their original acts to solo things, and were just kind of living on their name and reputation, doing the same kind of formulas that had worked a couple years before.
Right. So they're delayed in the trends because they were making their album back when this was popular.
Right. And because in the 1970s the record industry was making money hand over fist, there was really no reason to invest in mid-level or low-level artists. Not when they could make so much money on a sure thing, even if the sure thing's music was, God bless Eddie Kendrick, but an Eddie Kendrick single, and not a single from his original band.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, and I think that was part of the reason of the rise of the independent labels over the last 20 years and the demise of the major labels, because they stuck with that paradigm. And now you have a market. Now, I think that there's been something, there's the middle class artists. It used to always be the starving artists or the 2%. Now I feel like there's a lot of, middle class art, musicians out there.
Yeah, it's kind of lower middle class, but it's middle class.
But you take a band like, there's a ton of bands, OK Go, Matt and Kim, The National, My Morning Jacket. All these bands have had very little, if any, commercial radio play, but they can go and sell out the Wiltern any day of the week. They get tons of merch, they get placements, and they all make a great living. And I think that model was not around.
Grizzly Bear might dispute that great living part.
Well, I wouldn't put Grizzly Bear in the same as My Morning Jacket and some of those other ones, but
no, not quite as big, but certainly as critically revered.
Sure.
And certainly, at their height, were kind of had the same sort of touring weight as a touring band. But yeah. I'm not sure how much of that is a great living. But it's a living.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to go over a couple of other things. What do you do when you're free? If you're trying to unwind, or if you're having, journalists, do you ever get the writer's block? Do you ever?
All the time.
Yeah. What do you do to either, well, A, cure that, and B, just unwind? I mean, I know that a lot of you're kind of like
I try to read something that that's totally blind.
What do you mean by that?
It's like if I'm writing a music piece, if I'm writing a freelance feature story or a blog item or something like that, and I'm just flat out of words, because I got to tell you that happens.
More often than not, or is it?
These days, yeah. I've been doing it a long time now, and I will try to sit down with something totally unrelated to what I have writer's block about.
Okay.
And I still love reading great sports writing. I'll sit down and read one of the fine takeout stories in Sports Illustrated or something like that.
Sure.
And a lot of writing is all about getting into a rhythm, and sports writing has a certain rhythm and poetry to it that I've always loved.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll just pick a random book off the shelf and maybe not even start at the beginning. Just like, try to clear your head.
Just kind of reset your battery a little bit.
And sometimes I'll just take a senior citizen's nap, damn it. Because sometimes if you sit down on the couch and cuddle up with your puppy and doze off for about 40 minutes.
You're like, I got it. Yeah.
It's really great.
Yeah.
Of course, then you have to start drinking coffee all over again. But
what about are you hard on yourself when it comes to writing? Do you read something, oh, this is shit, and throw it out?
Sometimes.
Yeah. I'm
not as hard on myself as I used to be.
Do you edit yourself? Or do you have someone that proofreads, or you gotten to be a pretty good editor?
As people as my Facebook friends, thank you very much, Facebook friends. As my Facebook friends who sometimes DM me with pointing out the typographical errors in the stuff I've just published.
I hate that.
I do edit myself, and I'm not as sharp as a tack as I used to be about it. My wife is a copy editor by trade, but I can't get her to copy edit my music stuff. She's just like, I'm not going to read that stuff.
So, what do you say to kids, and you do work with a lot of the millennials, when they talk to you about their dreams and their aspirations? Do you have kind of a nugget of advice or something that you tell them?
Yeah, I do. It's three words. Progress is incremental. Progress is incremental.
What do you mean by that?
Things happen a little bit at a time. They do not happen overnight. Progress is incremental.
Yeah.
Just if you can do one thing, if you can make one move or add one line to your resume that you think is a small stepping stone towards where you eventually want to be, with that 5-year, where I want to be 5 years from now dream that everybody has, then do it. Don't necessarily just go for the gold overnight
and think you can get it. Yeah.
And think you can get it because, unless you're a phenom, and there are phenoms. I've known some phenoms. I've known some people who've gotten the gold overnight.
Sure.
And congratulations to them. But a little bit at a time, and be okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Be okay with that. Sometimes you even have to take it a step backward to put yourself in a position to take 2 steps forward.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly when I think back on some of the decisions I've made, it's like, wow, that seemed like so much trouble at the time. And then 6 months later, it didn't seem like any trouble at all because it paid off.
Right. Do yourself a favor. Go now, Buzzbands.la. Read some of Kevin's work. It's a brilliant website. It's all laid out. I mean, you want to find out venues in LA, bands, everything. It's all there, Buzzbands.la. Kevin Bronson, thank you so much, man. I feel like
thanks for having me, Darren. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, man. Take care.
All right, you too.
That was great.